I am unashamed. What about you?
All right, welcome to Unashamed. We realize this will air later, but I did wear my red today because it's whose phone is that? That's me. Sorry. It is Valentine's Day, and that was my Valentine, so I guess you could interrupt. It is Valentine's Day, and so we all have a different. And Zach is back. Zach, welcome back.
I'm back.
We do appreciate you sitting out the most difficult one of the most difficult passages in the Bible.
Yeah,
he had some important meetings while we were dealing with 1 Peter 3.
Like, where y'all at? 1 Peter 3, 18 through 4, 6. No,
with a whole chapter, because we got the wives and the husbands. It was
I missed out on all that. I missed out on all. But George Bush said, what do you call it? Strategery. That's my strategery.
Well, you did send your much better half. That, by the way, Unashamed Nation is now coming out in droves saying, forget Zach, just have Jill on the podcast.
Or Jill. Sorry, Zach.
Jill has outshone you yet again.
I can't say too much because they also said the same thing about Missy, so I'm told. So.
Oh, let's be honest. It'd be a much better podcast if it was our 4 wives, but that's a fact.
Yeah, so one of our producers said, as soon as the podcast was over, because we did 2, she looks at me and she says, "Ooh, Unashamed Wives podcast." I said, yeah, we've thought of that. So
that'd be a good idea.
It's Valentine's Day here. We're recording, and obviously it's going to record a little bit later. But I wanted to kind of see what our approach is. Now, for me, it's a big day. I'm wearing a red shirt. I got a hot date tonight with my Valentine. It's a big deal in my home, and it always has been. My daughter's here on set, and so I had 2 girls, and so I always made a big deal, not just for Lisa, but for the girls, and so I would buy decorations and cook dinner and serve them and have candlelight dinner, and since I had girls in my house, I wanted it to be a big deal, and now she does that with her family. She and her husband, they make it a family thing, so it's always been a big deal at my house, and I realize it's commercialized. I get all the arguments. Some people don't get into it. I understand. I'm not saying you have to do it. But I do want to kind of get everybody's opinion about Valentine's Day. And I have a picture here. Dad, I wanted to show this to you because I don't know if you've seen it. And so apparently you had a big Valentine's gift to Mom. And so here's a picture that I was sent yesterday. Mom, and we're going to show this because I sent it to Madison.
Now, this is from Phil?
This is from Phil to Mom. I'm sure by way of emissary, you didn't actually go shopping to buy these balloons.
Yeah, you went and did this?
Everybody calm down. I couldn't see my woman for the balloons. The balloons were brought in by one Dan Stevenson who works for us.
Okay.
Better known as the eunuch.
Okay.
So I would just simply interject one little text. I checked the Bible from cover to cover, and I didn't come up with Valentine. Valentine Day, Mr. Valentine, no. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival. I would say possibly.
Maybe. They do say Saint Valentine's. Okay.
Saint Valentine's. So
in Colossians 2, right?
Here's the Apostle Paul, or with regard to a religious festival, which seems to be a Valentine's type day, a new moon celebration, that's one that I'm not familiar with, or a Sabbath day, that I am. These things are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So I think he's saying if you get wrapped up in a lot of religious festivals and all, you possibly could miss the reality of God becoming flesh, dying on a cross, being buried and raised from the dead.
Don't want to miss Jesus.
Don't be overcome. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility, for whatever reason, and the worship of angels disqualify you for the prize. They go into great detail about what they've seen on spiritual mind. There are some people who have lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. Since you died with Christ to the basic principles of this world, why, as though you still belong to it, that you submit to its rules and whatever? Don't handle, don't touch, don't taste, don't that. They're all destined to be gone, and they're based on human commands and teachings. And there is such regulation, and indeed have an appearance of wisdom in lieu of watching Valentine Day. Self-imposed worship, false humility, harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. That's just a little read from Colossians on how we're to view various religious festivals that might pop up, because there's quite a few of them if you go across Christianity through the length of time that we've all been here. So I'm just saying, as far as I'm concerned, the reality is found in Jesus. Don't miss the fact, in lieu of Mr. Valentine or anybody else. I think he was I think he was a follower of Jesus, and I think that he was lifted up, maybe a little bit high. So
I looked it up. The origin of Valentine's Day. So Saint Valentine was a clergyman, either a priest or a bishop, in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so we're going back.
Okay, Roman Empire.
Who ministered to persecuted Christians.
Ooh, like that.
He was martyred and his body buried in the Via Flaminia on
But let's not get off on what Phil's saying here, though. I mean, this is great news for those of us who often forget to get their wife a present on Valentine's Day. And if they ever get mad, you just go to Colossians chapter 2 and say, you can't judge me. Don't let anyone. So this is a way out. This is Colossians 2 is the escape hatch. If you forget,
I don't think that's going to work. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to try it, but I mean, but if somebody wants to try it, I would like to know if that works. Just quote Colossians 2 on them. That'd be good.
Yeah.
That's just a thought.
I thought it was interesting that this guy was actually
a good guy,
a Christian. Yeah. I mean, of course, it says now it's more of just a cultural celebration.
Sure. Well, look, it's like any other of the holidays that had a root in something spiritual or good. It becomes commercial, and I get why people don't make a big deal.
If it was possible that you could get maybe wrongly develop a belief for someone other than Jesus, you might bring in Mr. Valentine and you say, let's celebrate Mr. Valentine because he was persecuted and killed, I guess, is the...
Well, and let's face it, most times now it's about love. And obviously from this picture, your wife, my mother, Miss Kay, was enjoying the moment of all these balloons. I do think it's interesting. So those of you that...
I wouldn't jump up and go to hollering about the
Those
balloons.
of you that watch the podcast, you'll be able to get a look at this picture. If you look in the very corner of it, you'll see Dad looking, I'm guessing, at the TV, not seeming to revel in the moment as much as Mom is. So I thought that was interesting.
I wouldn't jump up and make an issue out of this. Yeah. I wouldn't make it an issue.
So, Jay, you got big plans for?
Well, usually we
have production.
Usually I get her flowers, but at this, the last few days we've been preoccupied doing
had a lot going on.
So I think we've just agreed that we love each other, and maybe we'll do better next Valentine's Day.
This Valentine's Day was more of a fiery trial of
being loving towards your woman is a good thing. So
it's a good thing.
It's always good to be remembered, whatever the occasion.
I think when you have a week like we've had, the love is experienced at a higher level. You did this together, and
you got through something.
I think Saint Valentine would not have wanted people to worship him.
No,
not
if he was a martyr who looked after persecuted saints, for sure.
But
it's not bad to have something named.
I find this interesting that a legend states that he defiled the emperor's orders, which I guess is why he was killed.
Yep.
And secretly married couples to spare the husbands from war.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that was the accusation.
That's where the love thing came from.
Yeah.
So, who knew? I didn't know this.
Interesting. Zach, what about you and Jill? Do you guys do something special on Valentine's Day, or do you have?
I've been known to forget, but kind of
like you do podcasts. Just easily forgotten.
Well, I was just trying to move the whole train. Yeah, the whole thing along. We actually been editing Phil's film, but I don't want to be like do this whole shameless plug thing. So I won't do that. But so that's where I've been.
I knew you didn't want to do a shameless plug when I looked over your left shoulder and saw what is that thing called?
The sticks. The sticks from the movie.
The sticks that says the blind.
Now we don't have to say it anymore.
But anyway,
I don't have to say it. Yeah, okay. Not going there. What was the question?
Do you guys do something?
I got up early this morning. I drove to the grocery store down the road. I waited for it to open before Jill got up. I got her some flowers, had those ready. What else did I do? We're going on a date tonight.
Yeah.
Well,
which is we're actually going to the Cove, which is the you've been there, Al, right? The Billy Graham Association, the Cove here in Swananoa.
I love it.
And she's been going to a Bible study there on the Book of Acts. It's just for women, and they've planned that on tonight, Valentine's, everybody's gonna invite their husbands. So we're actually doing dinner and the Bible study.
So our old friend Will Graham runs the Cove, and it's beautiful. It's right there in the mountains, just below Zach there in Swananoa, and they have a beautiful facility there and cabins up in the mountains, and they do retreats there and Bible study deals, and it's really nice. And Elise and I've been there several times. Will and those guys do a great job. That's great.
Remember that time they had that event for Sadie? It was a women's event, and there were only 2 guys there. Me and you, Zach. The 2 people that didn't get the memo.
me and Jase up there holding down the fort.
I was feeling really nervous. Then I thought Zach, and I thought, well, okay. At least
Jase walked in like a deer in the headlights. He's like, "What have I walked into?" And he turns the corner, and our eyes connected. And he was like, he just locked in. That was funny.
No, that was all the other guys. Well, Missy didn't tell me because she's like, "Well, we're family. You're family, so that doesn't apply." I was like, "Where's that written?" Yeah. Women only is women only.
No, I went to that reminds me, Lisa and I spoke at a women's thing that they do in Mackinac Island, Michigan. And it's this beautiful island that's in Lake Michigan, literally in Lake Michigan. And we went up and spoke, and it was a ladies' event, but they did back to back to back. The place would only hold 1,000 women.
So was it on a boat or something?
The boat went out to it. It took you
it's an island.
It's an island, so it takes you 45-minute boat ride to get out to this place. It's beautiful. This is hotel big. It's called the Grand Hotel up on top of this island. The hotel's been there 150 years. And so there's 1,000 women times 3. They're there 24 hours in 3 times. And so we spoke 2 or 3 times during the course of this 3 days. And it was 1,000 women every time. It was the most energetic, enthusiastic group of people I've ever spoken to. These women were fired up. And it was me. I was the first man that's ever spoken at the conference with Lisa. And then there was this other lady that spoke, her husband. So it was just like you and Zach. It was 2 men and 3,000 women.
On an island.
On an island. And so I came out, my opening line, I came up with this on my own, Dad. I came out and I said, I know nobody here can relate to this except this guy right here. And I pointed at him. He was sitting there, this woman's husband. I said, have you ever felt like a drop of testosterone in an ocean of estrogen? Of course, the women laughed, and then we were off and running. So that was
I wouldn't even have known what any of those words
Yeah, those are big words.
I would have gone with there's a thin line between Lake Michigan and Alcatraz.
That's a pretty good line.
They wouldn't have laughed.
They wouldn't have laughed. That's the difference, Jase. I knew how to get them. That's the difference.
But really, that's
started making them laugh and offending them right off the bat.
Some marriages flourish, and some feel more like a prison.
That's right. That's exactly right. So anyway, it's after Valentine's Day, but since it is for us here, we thought we'd open.
Well, I heard you guys had a couple good episodes. I went back and watched the one on marriage and
with the wives.
A lot of good feedback. Yeah. So apparently
So
it went really
I was
well.
going to ask you about that. Hang on. Let's take a break.
What was your opinion of that? I've never listened to one of our podcasts. I just can't do it.
Yeah, what was the feedback? Did people like it? Did people?
They liked it a lot. There was one comment that that someone who is a big supporter of our podcast made that I thought was interesting. But she said, it's hard for her to watch it because she didn't grow up in a she wasn't a Christian until after she went through a lot of marital problems and had issues and something. It's just like I think she felt a little bit like, man, it was hard for her to watch it. But I think that the thing about it is that, like, to me, if you hear everybody's stories in marriage, like, nobody's got it together. Everybody's coming to the party with a ton of baggage, and there's people that have had broken marriages and things like that. But, there's always hope in Jesus. I hope that's what most people got out of it. I think that is what most people got out of the conversation. Jill had mentioned, Missy and Jase's comments and about the marriage night, and she said, I want my boys to watch this. You know what I mean? It's like, you need to understand what real intimacy looks like. And I think that's hard for a lot of people to get. It's hard for me to get because I didn't, I wasn't necessarily pure going into marriage. And it's hard to understand a relationship where performance is not the metrics of success. You know what I mean? But that's real intimacy is not performative. It's much more about being present. And
it was kind of interesting, Zach, because Lisa and I were tasked with speaking on physical intimacy at our marriage refresh this past weekend, which was a few days after those podcasts that we recorded, and so a lot of what was said on the podcast kind of got us started into our preparation for the retreat, the refresh. And we started with that because our approach was we talked about the ideal intimacy in the Bible. And you talked about this a lot from Genesis 2, 24 and 25. And then you get into the real and the surreal, when sin enters the picture, and then how quickly it goes off the rails, right? By the time you get into Genesis 4, 5, and 6, and you see that kind of fig leaf mentality. And as it goes forward, all of humanity falls off the deep end just in a few short generations. And it goes from what started out as just shame, from evil, from the introduction of evil into just pure violence and wickedness.
That's why no matter what you're listening to or whatever kind of days they come up with and these acts of worship, the bottom line is the Apostle Paul in that Colossians text, the reality is found in Christ. You just can't miss that.
Right.
The reality is found right there.
Right.
The ones who removed their sin, put us under grace, and raised us from the dead.
Yeah, so what we did was we painted a picture, because you got a lot of people in the case of people we were speaking to that came into their marriage not from an ideal perspective, but from a very surreal perspective, which Lisa and I did as well, where you had a lot of bad baggage and situations going in. So then you have to work it backwards. Yep. The only way you can be repaired and restored is through what Christ has done. Yep. And so you work your way back to the ideal. And Christ is the only one that can do that, So the idea is, instead of going ideal to real to surreal, you go the other direction, and then you get back to an ideal by what Christ restores in us. And so that's kind of how we painted our picture for physical intimacy in a relationship.
Yeah, because if you think about the most marriages that have major problems, and I look back at my own marriage, like when at the times when I'm like, man, we got. Where I felt like there was major problems. I mean, I know it's relative, but I felt like there was major problems, and it was predicated in my situation and most of the people that we've worked with and met with over the years. It was predicated on unnecessary shame. It was the shame that was a result of I have an expectation of performance in whatever area. A lot of times it's sexual performance. I mean, that's a big deal just because the culture around us it's just always telling you that to be your most authentic self is to be your most sexually free, or you can express yourself sexually. So this is like reinforced at every turn in culture. So you begin to associate your identity with your sexuality and your performance in that. But the problem is when you fail to perform, or if someone else fails to perform in the way that you expect them to, then there's that brokenness, and then there's that shame, and then there's that covering, and then there's that hiding, and then there's the whole thing, because it's built on like a transaction, and you're not meeting up to your transaction. But to Phil's point in Colossians 2, when we say that, when Paul says that the reality is found in Christ, you got to keep in mind what he's talking about there is he's laying out, first of all, like this legalism, right? You got to do all these things. You got to adhere to these religious festivals. You got to do all the things.
Yep.
And Paul's like, no, don't let anyone judge you on that. He says the reality is found in Christ, and then he exalts Christ. Well, what is Christ? What do we mean when we say the reality is in Christ? Well, Christ is the incarnation of God, meaning that it is God, Emmanuel, God with us, God's present with us, which is the core of intimacy, is this idea of presence, that I'm here, and I'm here no matter what. Like God came to humanity while we were enemies, Paul says in Romans 5, while we were hostile to the cross, while we were hostile to God, while we were enemies, while we were sinners. This is when God was present. This is when God came to be with man and was with us. And if you could embody that in a relationship in your marriage, then what you're going to find is real lasting intimacy, because it's not based on performance, which is the whole Paul's point in Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved his church and laid himself down for her.
Right.
I mean, that's intimacy. And I just think that so often, so many young people go into marriage particularly with the physical stuff in mind, and they're expecting this physical. We preach it in the church too. It's like a form of the prosperity gospel. Like wait until you get married to have sex, and then you do, and it's going to be fireworks. And sometimes it's not. When your kids are throwing up, and there's diarrhea everywhere, dirty diapers, that does put a hamper on the sex game.
Or when you're throwing up, or diarrhea, or
yeah, even worse. Yeah.
Well, we even talked,
or BO, or there's a lot.
We even talked about it was Jase mentioned this a minute ago with their scenario of their situation for the past few days, but how as you run through the seasons of life typically, and you get healthier and healthier in all areas of intimacy, and we're talking about emotional intimacy along with spiritual and physical, how when they blend together, and Dad mentions this a lot, as you get older, it's much less about just sex. It encompasses the whole relationship. It's being together. And so Jase was mentioning that about spending a weekend of going through a trial with a situation where then it's not just about some romantic evening. It's about what we've gone through together as a couple. It's much bigger than just one evening or one.
Well, I'll clarify that because it's been a year, and I made the statement, and because I told someone in Missy's presence that this was the toughest year that I'd ever spent of dealing with this situation. And Missy said when you said that, she told me this last night. She was like, I thought, what's he talking about? She said, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, he's right. This is, and we're talking about we have a girl who had special needs and surgeries and just the drama and everything involved, and so it kind of culminated this past week, and we feel good about it moving forward. But my point is, because even in Peter, because I started thinking it's not an accident that I happened to be studying 1 Peter while we're going through this, and this has really spoke to my heart in powerful ways. And he mentioned in chapter 1 where he said about these trials coming up, but it's really deeper than trials. Verse 7 says of chapter 1, these have come so that your faith of greater worth than gold, which perishes, even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus is revealed. And he brings it up again in chapter 4 where we're at. The NIV, in my opinion, has a terrible translation on verse 12 because he uses the same word for fire in verse 12. Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal.
Yeah.
You are suffering as though something strange. So he keeps coming back to that. And you think, well, what's the deal? when you think about what fire does, because we've been in the fire, this has been a trial.
Yep.
And a lot of the trial part of it was not up to us. It was just outside. You're dealing with different agencies and programs, and you got multiple people involved, and the drama of a innocent baby, and emotions run high automatically, and so. But what you realize is that fire that refines, it can do one or two things when you put like a rock. It if it's just all dross, I think is the word, it just would incinerate.
Yeah.
But that gold actually is the metal refines where you can
takes out
see
the imperfection.
Image. That's right.
And it makes it even more valuable.
I think this is the thing. A lot of our obsession with, sensualities and these are luxuries, right? A lot of things we're talking about, even in culture today, or we get to the whole quote unquote culture war, and we're talking about all the shenanigans that go around with all that. Most of that stuff that we're arguing about it's like a luxury to be able to argue about that. Because if you're in a position of suffering, then all this stuff gets burned up. The drunkenness, the carousing, the sensuality, the lust, the drinking parties. You think about when I read that, I'm thinking this is like the roaring 20s, right? This is when money was just flowing freely. There's just excess everywhere. It's just a big party. And then what happened? 1929, the Great Depression, the stock market collapses. And this stuff all got eaten up in the fire. So I think that, what do you do in your life because suffering is coming? You can't get around it. At some point you get sick and you die. That's a reality. And so I think what suffering allows us, even in times like what you're going through, Jase, and we've gone through some similar things, it's that refiner's fire, because it's putting the things that matter in perspective, and the things that we have elevated to the position of God that we're worshiping that aren't God, that can never deliver us. And in fact, they just send us into further despair. Those things are almost, it's like the fire burns that away, because you're looking at it, you're like, that's not going to fulfill anybody.
I think the reading with the most power in my mind is in Romans chapter 2. Check this out. Do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance? This is God toward us. He's kind, tolerant, patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you toward repentance. And here's the kicker on all this. But because of your stubbornness, humanity, and your unrepentant heart, you're storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. He's coming back on all this. God will give to each person according to what he's done. For those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. That's everybody. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, for God does not show favoritism. I make it a policy to always remember that, because one, it's scary, but human beings can get pretty stubborn, Zach, and they can hold on to things that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. And God's been very kind to say, I love you, and I'm going to save you, even with your stubbornness and unrepentant hearts. I'm trying to get you to see that justice is coming, and the end is always coming.
That's why he lets us go through trials.
That was Romans 2.
Suffering.
That's Romans chapter 2, which it always
if you back up a little bit in Romans, when he describes the wrath of God that's being revealed against all the wickedness and godlessness, when he describes what that is, it's simply God leaving you to yourself. It's God removing his presence. And so when you move into 1 Peter chapter 4, why do we do that? A lot of times we do these things because we want to avoid suffering in our life. So we're doing the things that would numb us from the reality that there is suffering. But the godly perspective, the biblical perspective, is that we actually lean into the suffering, and into that suffering we're connected with Christ. If we are connecting with Him. So it says, therefore, verse 1, since Christ has suffered, because He certainly did suffer in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. So we're connecting with the same type of suffering that Christ endured, because He who has suffered, so here's the reason why we do it. He who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God. And I love that translation, because a lot of times we say, we're not to live in the flesh. Well, it depends on what you mean by that. I am in the flesh. I live in a body right now. It's what is the aim and the end of my living in the flesh? Is it to obey the lust of my sinful nature, the lust of men, or is it to live for the will of God? And I think that's the alignment that He is calling us to, is to align ourselves with His will.
That's Romans 2 again.
But if the fire is causing sufferings, though, then it really, in practical terms, it lets you see what you're trusting in. I heard somebody say that when you run upon somebody that says life has no meaning, or life is meaningless, you got a whole book, Ecclesiastes. What has happened? What has happened is whatever they put their trust in is dead.
Yep.
And it's a blanket statement, but it's a true statement. When you feel hopeless and life is meaningless, whatever you put your hope in, it couldn't take the heat, and it's dead. And so that's really what the fire refining does. I wanted to read, one of the most famous passages in the Bible, probably in the top 10, right behind John 3:16, that people read just as an altar call, is Revelation 3:20, when he says...
Before you read that, let's take a break.
In Revelation 3:20, it says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me." But when you look at the context of that, this is the letter that Jesus wrote. In verse 15, he said, "I know your deeds. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish you were one or the other. Because you're lukewarm, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth." In verse 17, "You say I'm rich. I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." Now watch what he says in 18. "I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so you can become rich, and white clothes to wear, so you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes, so you can see. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent." Well, then he says that. And then in verse 21, he says, "To him who overcomes, I'll give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father on the throne." There's going to be fire, and it's good because it sees where your trust lies.
Yeah, I was going to say, this doesn't make any sense what we're saying, or what not. We're not saying this. What Peter and the Apostle Paul are saying, it makes no sense unless you have to have one word that pulls this together. When you talk about suffering, it makes no sense unless you grasp the word resurrection, because there's always a resurrection out of this. And that's the hope that we're kind of hanging on to. So you go back up to the end of chapter 3, when he talks about baptism. What does he say? He says, of course, the waters of Noah corresponds to that baptism, which now saves you, but it's not the removal of dirt from the flesh. It's not it's not the water that saves you, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So when you think, even what baptism is, Romans 6 and all that, it's like we're connecting with Christ in baptism, meaning that we're dying to self and we're being raised to live a new life. Even that Romans, at the end of Romans 6, we become slaves to God. We become slaves to righteousness. And I think that's the dichotomy there. That I think what we're trying to explain, and it's hard to get as humans, that man, suffering just seems miserable, right? Why would I want to do that? Well, if you don't understand the biblical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, like there is a resurrection. Like it's not, you don't just sit in it. You don't just sit in your suffering. God's raising you up to live a new life that's being connected now with the will of God, which happens to be, by the way, the thing that Phil mentioned in Romans 2. That's where you get your peace of mind from.
By
you get
the way,
your peace of mind from being connected with Him.
That last little statement in that Peter made in First Peter 3 there, baptism saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven. He's there 24/7, not counting his sins against you. He's at God's right hand, mediating for us to keep us cleansed. We're under grace, not law, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Well, if that's the case, you better be submissive to him too. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, and you think of the question, how? Like, how does baptism? What does that mean? That saves you by the resurrection? What it means is that if I come to God as I am, and I say, God, and I lift up my hands, and I got all my stuff in there, and I'm like, give me what I deserve, give me what I've earned. If I come in that way, then the answer is going to be, all right, I'm going to just kill you because you deserve death, because we bring nothing to the table. And so the reason why we have to be connected with His resurrection is because I can't come to God as I am. People say, "Come as you are." Well, you come as you are, but you better not stay as you are, or He's not going to let you. You don't bring anything to the table. You have to get somehow connected to His righteousness. And so, if you read Romans 6, it explains it perfectly, that we are united with Christ in His death, in His burial, and His resurrection, so that we may live a new life. So now that when I come before God what did I come for? I came seeking a clean conscience. So I come to God and say, man, I want my conscience to be clean.
Well
Problem
said.
is, if I bootstrap myself up, I can't. My conscience isn't clean because I know what I've done. But if I'm connected with the resurrection of Christ, now I can come to God the Father and say, God, I'm clean, not because of what I've done, but because of the finished work of Christ, and I've been raised with Him. So when you move into 1 Peter 4, that word is therefore, because what we just said, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. All of this was made possible by the suffering of Christ. All the entire inclusion of the Gentiles, which is mentioned in here, our whole everything, all of it was made possible through the suffering of Christ. But it wasn't just the suffering; it was the suffering that led to a death that resulted in a resurrection of the dead.
Which that's Romans chapter 2 all over again. Live the rest of his life. As a result, he does not live the rest of his earthly life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. It's a great change in a human being. I'm just glad it's available.
But you're not going to have that clarity when you're on vacation. I mean, that's why the trouble comes. I've been hanging out in Jeremiah 2 a lot. I did that last podcast about the broken cisterns and all. There's another interesting passage here. I mean, this was the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah, who was persecuted just at nauseum for years and years and years and years, and no one would respond. And so the word of the Lord came to him in verse 27, and he said, "They say to wood, you are my father. They say to a rock or a stone, you gave me birth. They have turned their backs to me and not their faces. Yet when they're in trouble, they say, come and save us."
Yep.
"Where then are the gods you made for yourselves? Let them come if they can save you when you are in trouble. But you have as many gods as you have towns." And it's really goes in with what we're talking about here.
Yep.
When you're comfortable and you have accolades and your accomplishments, and you start thinking that there's something to it, when you start thinking about a fire purifying what's important, and you go through trouble, all of a sudden all these things start crumbling.
Yep.
And you become depressed or bitter. I mean, because there's really only two ways to handle these trials. You're either mad and bitter, or you look to the Lord because you realize,
Yep.
we can't do this.
It reminded me, Jason, that Jeremiah passage at that period of time. I think it may have been the Judges, where when the Ark of the Covenant would go in, and somebody had captured it, and they took it in, and there was this other false god, and I think his name was Dagon, Dagon. But anyway, you can look it up, and they would put the Ark of the Covenant, before this false god. It was a little wooden thing they had carved out, these people that had captured the Ark. And every day they would come in and it'd be on the floor, bowing down back to the Ark of the Covenant. It was just happened supernaturally overnight. And finally, they kept putting it back in its place. And finally, they came back one day. It was just broken into pieces. And I thought, you don't want to have a God that you have to nail down to be able to serve. That tells you all you need to know about serving gods that you come up with yourself.
Yeah.
Versus the Almighty. And it was just a great illustration.
You think about all other gods and religions, they just basically say, do good or suffer the consequences, follow the law. Here's your manuscript. And you think about what God did in Jesus. Well, he submitted himself and suffered for us and showed us the example and the true reason for why we suffer and why we submit. And when you look at what happened in his scheme of redemption and all the benefits that came from that, well, where are you going to find that in any other religion? Everything else is you. If you respond correctly, you might make it. And if you don't, you won't.
It's a great tool, what you just mentioned, thinking about these cisterns, these broken cisterns, and you think about what can they actually hold, you know what I mean? And it's a good technique, I think, and a good apologetic. There's a term in logic called reductio ad absurdum. Here's a big word for the day, which basically means you.
That was not a word. Hang on, time out. That was a phrase. That was not a word.
Okay, good point. It's a phrase.
Yeah.
I won't use it in a sentence, but I'll explain it. It's it's a tool that you basically take an argument and then you push it to the extreme to see if it holds, or you take the opposite of what you're saying and then you push it out to see if it holds. And if it doesn't hold, then you're like, it can't be logical. And so
what was the phrase again for us?
Reductio ad absurdum, or argumentum. I think it's also called argumentum absurdum. You're making these like ridiculous. You're pushing things to the end. So, but take what you said for example. Take this broken cistern. We went off the rails.
Before you make the point,
I know.
How long did it take you to practice that? I would have, if I was ever going to drop that in a conversation.
A couple of weeks off to work on something.
Are you driving down the road, looking in the rearview mirror, saying "audio matus cerdum"?
Well, I did get my sister took a screenshot. I'm not going to even send it to you because you'll love it. But it's somebody that put something on the Unashamed Facebook page that is basically making fun of me and siding with. It's a meme. I'm not going to send it to you, but you would have loved it. And I thought, man, I'm glad Jase doesn't look on this page because he would eat this up. But
let me read Jeremiah 2:13 that I read last podcast about that. He said, "My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water," which, reminds you of what Jesus said and did in John 4 with the woman at the well. And then it says, "They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water."
Yeah, so think about all of the things that we elevate to these positions of God in our life. I mean, when First Peter mentions a few of them: sensuality, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, abominable idolatries. These are things that we hold up that we think can sustain us. I would add in there politics in 2023, gender ideology, whatever the thing is, right? Even church, even good things. But can these things really bear the weight of your soul? Can these things really bear, if you put everything on them, everything, I just take whatever the one thing is, I'm going to put all the reality, everything is going to be on this thing.
They all die. They all die.
They all crumble. They can't hold the water. That's the problem. They can't hold it, which is what Jesus kind of alluded to when he said, hey, look, I'm bringing some new wine, but you got to be careful if you put them in your old wineskins, because what happens if you put them in there? They won't hold it. You got to have a new wineskin. You got to have a new cistern. You got to have a new pillar. You got to have a new foundation. Jesus, the cornerstone. Man, that's how you can push through these things and think, man, will this really deliver? So whatever your thing is that you're kind of like tempted with, or whatever your default is, just run that to its end and say, can this really hold the weight of everything? And the answer is always no. It cannot hold the weight of in fact, it can't hold the weight of hardly anything.
I think that's why he says that in 1 Peter 4:1, where he says, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. Because when you think about the consequences of suffering, it's actually a positive when you're doing it for the will of God.
Yep.
When you think about the consequences of your sin.
Very much so.
Yeah, when you think about the consequences of your sin, it's 10,000 times worse as far as the pain that is caused by your own sin.
Oh, yeah.
You can never take it back. No. People are always going to struggle with being bitter at you.
Zach was onto something. It's also back to the whole theme Paul had in Romans, and Dad as well, Romans 2-6, but also 7 and 8, Zach, because Paul brings in this picture of the battle of the flesh, right, in Romans 7. And then he gets to Romans 8 and says, but look, we've been freed from this because of the Spirit.
There is now no condemnation.
Exactly, because now how do we understand the will of God? By the Spirit of God. Yep. So that's the difference maker. That's why that Peter makes sure and includes the ascension of Jesus after the resurrection, because we made this point at the end of the last podcast. He includes the ascension because that was the point in time which the Spirit was then poured out for all of humanity to live in us. How are we going to understand the will of God? Romans 12:1. Because now the Spirit lives in us. So that's spiritual act of worship. Peter makes
a point. Everything else is submitting to him. You have to also.
That's right.
That's what he's saying.
So the only way we can live, even though we are still in this life and we commit sin, is if the Spirit of God leads us, and as we're sanctified in Him.
And it's a case of protection. In other words, he has suffered in his body and is done with sin. Arm yourselves. It's like armor. That sounds like to the Ephesians. Arm yourselves with the same attitude.
Yeah, which is why I said, Zach, I spent 15 minutes last podcast talking about that first word, therefore, because if you don't have that therefore, Jesus at the right hand of God, the resurrection, him dying for sins once and for all, well, then you're not going to accomplish this. You're only... That is a very important word, and I made a big deal about that because that is the basis for. I mean, unfortunately, they made it a new chapter, but it is that has to be connected to that.
Sure,
you're never going to be willing to look at suffering, and he's not saying, "Oh, you need to jump up and down every time you're in pain." No, but you find joy in it because you realize you're participating, you're partnering with Jesus and who he is and what he did.
Right.
It still doesn't feel good.
Right. That's exactly right. And that becomes part of the process. And every step of the way, as we kind of wind up our podcast here and get ready for overtime, every step of the way, he takes us back to Christ, his suffering, and his example. You notice that?
Every time.
Every segment that he's talked about,
it's a cosmic attitude.
That's it.
Boy.
Yeah. And every time we talked about this idea of submission and suffering, we go back to Jesus.
Yep.
Every time, over and over again. Now we're talking about lifestyle. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this in our overtime segment. If you want to follow us over, it's blazetv.com/unashamed. And we're going to discuss this a little bit more. So follow us over and we'll see you there.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.